Meegwetch for inviting me here today, and it's wonderful to be in a room with a bunch of wonderful people and beautiful women telling their stories, so Meegwetch for sharing as well. I wanted to talk today a little bit, Fazal he talked about what do we call ourselves, or how do we define ourselves, and it's very different here in Canada. That line that was sort of drawn in the sand between Canada and the US, it's not our line. Most of our communities do reside on both sides. So defining who we are is sometimes a little hard. It's not just an easy question, but I figured I'd start back at the beginning, because a lot of the problem is that we have been defined for ourselves. We have not been able to define ourselves. We've been defined by the government. I wanted to define the word Indian today. So if you go south of the border, Indian is still a word that's used, and the community still uses that. The national newspaper is still called Indian Country. People still define themselves as Indians. But here in Canada, it's a little different. So I looked at the Oxford Dictionary to get the actual definition of Indian. And one is relating or denoting the indigenous people of North, Central, and South America, especially those of North America. And then the second is relating to India, or the subcontinent comprising of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So it's interesting because depending on where you're from, the word Indian means something completely different. So sometimes when I'm around, people ask me, are you Indian? And I always have to say, well, the other Indian, right? Because depending on what this word means to you. But even though we don't in Canada really use this word, we are still defined by that word. So, and who defines us by that word? It's the government. And that is under the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is from 1876, even though it's been regularly amended. We are defined as Indians in this act, and the government defines us in a specific way. So, and this here is, some people call it a status card, some people call it a treaty card, and many people, it's an oppressive piece of legislation that discriminates against women still, and yes. Let me tell you how we're defined in this act. So, it's called blood quantums. So, you can read, it's pages long. So if you actually read all those pages, you'll read them all and you'll wonder, oh, I don't get this. Right? It's a really hard piece of legislation to look at, and it's not clear, it's not black and white, but the blood quantum definitely is. Hence why I'm actually using a black marker on white. So 1 plus 1 equals 1. All right? 1 plus 2 equals 1. 2 plus 0 equals 0, and a 0 plus a 0 equals a 0. Now, you might think I'm really bad at math, and truth be told, I didn't do well in school. That's a whole different story. But what the 1 donates is somebody who is considered of a full blood quantum, so both parents are also our status or treaty people. So, and that's a 1. So 1 plus a 1 will equal a 1. Their offspring, right, will be a 1. Now, if this 1, who again is considered to have a full blood quantum, marries a 2, so who is considered to have half of that blood quantum, that child now returns to being a 1. Okay? But if that 2, that person with the half blood quantum, has a child with somebody who is non-First Nations or doesn't fit into any of these, then that child is actually considered a 0. And then of course, the 0 plus a 0 equals a 0. So this legislation was actually made to eliminate us. And you can see how quickly we, as far as how the government defines who an Indian is, how quickly we are erased. Okay? So, you know, how are we defined? This, and if we could go to the next slide, a lot of times we are defined by words. So it's been 150 years, okay, and we've been defined by many words. And many of those words sexualize us as women, they degrade us, and they demean us, and many of those words, a lot of people don't realize, you know, wouldn't be appropriate to say or to call somebody. Some of these words are still being used in society today, and they definitely are not good words, and they're not words that we use to define each other. So when we define each other, past the Indian Act, and that's part of the legislation that we are trying to change, is so that we can be self-determining. So we can determine who we are. So we can be responsible for actually defining ourselves. And that is, like I said, a hard topic. Who am I? So am I a Anishinaabe, so an Ojibwe woman? Am I a Nipissing? But I am definitely a member of the Anishinaabe Nation. Some people talk about being Canadian citizens. Well, I am a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation. So, you know, there are many ways to define me. We talk about the word Indian, that's very commonly used south of the border, Native, Aboriginal, Indigenous, and there are people that will talk about why they will or will not use every one of those words. You know, the AB in front of original, why don't call us the original people? Why do we have to have a negative prefix to the word original? You know, we know now, science has proven we did not cross the Bering Strait. We have been here since the ice melted. So we are the original people. So defining us. I always say the best way, if you want to know, ask. Ask somebody. How do they want to be acknowledged as? Who do they want to be acknowledged as? You know, we are diverse in ourselves as Indigenous people. That is more of a global term. However, you know, Canada, unlike the US, we are very diverse in the original people that came here. So we've got our First Nations, then we have the Métis community, then we have the Inuit community. And all of us have a unique and diverse space, culture, traditions, language, and all of us are trying to bring those things forward so we can see ourselves in, you know, society. I always say, you know, do you know anybody who's Indigenous? Do you know anybody who is? You know, who are the people in your spaces and who are those voices in those spaces? And do they really include everybody, especially the original people of this land? So I wanted to start by how we're defining, because it's always good to start from one place. We've had 150 years and a lot of people are celebrating those. Those aren't something to celebrate for us. So what we can say now is after 150 years, this 151 year, this year one, can be the time where we start to talk, where we start to share those things, and we start to have those real conversations that we haven't been having. So Meegwetch for coming here today, Meegwetch for sharing, and for having me here. Meegwetch.